Are we live? I think we're live. Eric, Luke, welcome. Happy Bitcoin Independence Day.
Hey,
How are you doing?
we're doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Luke, how are you?
Okay. How are you?
Good, thanks. So it's cool to have you guys on. Bitcoin Independence Day, obviously both of you actually played a big role in that, in the UASF movements back in the days. I think you were two of the maybe most prominent supporters, or well-known and influential, I think, at least. So this Bitcoin Independence Day, this August 1st thing from a couple years ago, this was about SegWit activation, so soft fork activation. This is getting relevant again because we're looking at a new soft fork that might be coming up, Taproot, and just in general, the conversation of how to activate soft forks is sort of getting started again. So what happened a couple years ago is becoming relevant again. And
we don't want to repeat what happened a few years ago. We hopefully want to do this better this time.
Well, that's what I want to discuss with you guys. So that's why it's great to have you on. So let's start with that, Eric. A couple years ago, apparently something went wrong. Should we first very briefly mention there was this process called BIP9? Do you want to explain very briefly what that was, and then you can get into why that was a problem or what went wrong?
Sure. So, the first soft forks that were activated were just with a flag date, or were just written into the code. And later on, to make the transition more smooth, miner signaling was incorporated. And then BIP9 was this proposal which allowed several soft forks to be under activation at the same time, with the idea that there'd be like this extensibility to the protocol, and there'd be this whole process that we could use to add new features. But it turned out to actually be very, very messy. And I'm not sure that process is actually sustainable.
To be clear, the idea with BIP9 was there's this soft fork, there's a change to the protocol, and the challenge then is to get the network upgraded to that change without splitting the network between upgraded and non-upgraded nodes. So the idea was we'll let activation coordination depend on hash power. So once enough miners have signaled that they have upgraded, then the network recognizes this, all upgraded nodes recognize this, and they start enforcing the new rules. The reason that's a good idea is because if most miners do this, then there's no risk of chain splits, right? Because even non-upgraded nodes would follow the new, the upgraded version of the blockchain. Like
it would be the longest chain by default, all the other clients would follow that chain automatically.
Yeah, so that's the benefit of it, but apparently something went wrong.
Yes.
Or at least you think so.
So the first few soft forks were really not political at all. There was no contention, and SegWit was the first soft fork that really led to some controversy because of the whole block size, stuff that happened before, and it was just a really contentious time in the whole Bitcoin space. And then the activation became politicized, which was a really serious problem because BIP9 was not designed to deal with politics. It was designed to deal with activation by miner signaling just for the sake of what you were talking about, so that the network doesn't split. But it's really a technical process to make sure that everyone is on the same page. But the idea was that everyone was supposed to already be on board for this before the release. Without any politics. It wasn't any kind of voting system or anything like that. It was not designed or intended to be a voting system. But some people misunderstood it that way, and some people took advantage of the confusion to make it seem like it was a voting process. And so it became very abused, and miners started to manipulate the signaling process to actually mess with the Bitcoin price and other stuff. And so, it became really, really messy. And I don't think we want to do it that way this time again.
Yeah, so this coordination mechanism, this was basically granted to miners in a way in order to make the upgrades happen smoothly. And what you're saying, or your perspective, is that they started to abuse this right that they were given. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, so what happened was it had a 95% threshold, which was something that was actually pretty reasonable before, when it was mostly just technical upgrades that were not politicized at all. It was a safety kind of threshold where if 95% of the hash power is signaling for it, then for sure the network is not going to split, or it's almost for sure that the networks aren't going to split. But really, you only need more than the majority of hash power in order for the chain to be the longest chain. So you could actually lower that threshold and slightly increase the risk of a chain split. So the 95% threshold basically gave more than 5%. If any more than 5% of the hash power did not signal for it, basically they would get a veto right. They could veto the whole activation throughout. So it gave a very small minority the ability to veto a soft fork. And the default was that if it didn't activate, it would just basically not be locked in, and it would basically just fail. And so this was a problem because this was in the middle of the whole block size thing, and everyone wanted a resolution to this. So failure was not really an option. So.
Right, Luke, do you agree with this analysis? Is this also how you see it?
More or less, yeah.
All right, so then so then at some point there was this solution to break the deadlock, which was a UASF. This ultimately took shape in the form of BIP 148. Luke, I think you were involved with the early process of designing this. What was the idea behind BIP 148?
I wasn't really involved that early. I was actually opposed to it originally.
Why? Well, so let's get into it.
I more or less guess I didn't really analyze the implications fully.
Mm-hmm. So can you explain what BIP 148 did, or why it was designed the way it was designed?
It essentially just took the decision back from the miners. Just said August 1st, we're going to begin the process of activating this, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, and I think the specific way it did that was BIP 148 nodes would start rejecting blocks that didn't actually signal support for SegWit. Is that right? Yeah,
I mean, that's how most user-activated soft forks previously had been deployed. If you didn't, if the miners didn't signal the new version, their blocks would be invalid.
Yes, exactly. Well, there's a nuanced difference, I think, between actually activating SegWit itself, enforcing SegWit, or enforcing signaling for SegWit, right?
Well, previous soft forks had pretty much done both all the time.
Right. Do you know why?
Before BIP 9, it was just an incremental version number. The miners had to have the correct version number, or their blocks were invalid. So when block version 3 was released, all blocks version 2 and before became invalid.
Right. Well, at some point you did start supporting BIP 148.
Yeah.
Right. So why was that?
At one point, there was enough of the community that was saying, we are going to do BIP 148 no matter how many other people are on board. And from that point forward, once it was a sizable minority, the only way to avoid a chain split was to go all in.
Yeah, the game theory pretty much was pretty like all or nothing at that point.
Yeah, so how big does a minority like that need to be? Is there any sort of way to measure this or think about this or reason about this? What made you realize that there were enough users supporting this, so to say?
I mean, it really comes down to not so much the number of people, but the relevance in the economy. Can we just, all these people that are going to do BIP 148, can you just ignore them and kind of economically pressure them or cut them off from everyone else, or is that not viable anymore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so how do you make that decision? Like, how do you tell the difference between non-viable or viable?
Well, I think at this point, what we did was really try to talk to a lot of exchanges and a lot of other people in the ecosystem to see, to kind of assess their level of support, right? And a lot of users were very much in favor of it, but also when it became more clear that also a lot of the big economic nodes in the system were going to be using BIP 148, then it became pretty clear that it was kind of like do or die. It was all or nothing. And at that point, it was kind of like get everyone on board, or this is not going to work.
Ironically, one of the earliest BIP 148 supporters was BitPay, which was actually relevant back then.
Were they?
Yeah. I think they lost relevance soon after there, but back then it was more of a big deal.
Okay, so and you mentioned it's this do or die situation. So what are exactly the risks of die? Like what could go wrong with something like BIP 148?
Well, I mean, at this point, I think that we pretty much were sure that if people wanted to fork, they were going to fork, and there was a big push to fork. The whole BCH thing was kind of building up, and so it was kind of like, okay, if people want to fork off, let them fork off. Basically, wherever the economy goes, that's where people are going to gravitate towards. And we believed that they would gravitate towards using BIP 148 and insisting that everyone else did, because that was kind of in everyone's best economic interest. And that is actually what happened. And I mean, it was a risk, but I think that it was a calculated risk. And I think that there would have been a chain split no matter what. The question was, how can we make sure that the chain split has the least amount of economic repercussions for the people that actually want to stay on the SegWit chain?
Yeah. So to be clear about that, BIP 148 could have also led to a chain split and possibly reorgs, and like it was a risk in that sense, right?
Sure. I mean, we were in uncharted territory. I think that the theory was pretty sound, but I mean, there's always a risk. And I think that at this point, it was kind of the fact that there was a risk actually was part of the motivation for people to want to run BIP 148, because the more people that did that, the lower the risk would be.
Yes, that was a very interesting game theoretic sort of advantage that this particular BIP had. What do you guys think? Because there's disagreements about this, and to this day, what do you guys think BIP 148 actually did? Like, some people said it did nothing in the end. Miners were just the ones that upgraded the protocol. How do you see this? Luke, do you want to start?
It was very clearly BIP 148 that got SegWit activated. If it hadn't been, it would have been very clear to everyone, because the blocks would have been rejected by BIP 148 nodes. There's no way you could have got 100% miner signaling without BIP 148.
Eric, do you see it as like that as well? You agree with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think definitely BIP 148 played a huge role, but I think that there were a lot of factors that were very important. I think, for instance, the fact that SegWit 2x was going on, and the whole New York Agreement process, that whole thing, was going on, and I think that actually rallied people to want to support a user-activated soft fork even more. It was kind of ironic. Had the whole SegWit 2x thing not been happening, people might have been more complacent and just said, you know what, let's just hold off a little bit and wait and see what happens. I think that this kind of pressured everyone to take action, and it kind of seemed like there was an imminent threat, and so people needed to do something. And so that was the moment where I think that the game theory really started to work out, because then it would be possible to cross that threshold where it's like, it is do or die. Basically, at that point, it's like the point of no return.
Yeah. Well, so let me rephrase the question a little bit. Do you guys think SegWit would have been activated if BIP 148 hadn't happened? Like, would we have SegWit today?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think that eventually it might have activated, but I think that at that point, people wanted it, and it was kind of a decisive moment where people wanted a resolution. And the longer that it dragged on, the more uncertainty there was, and uncertainty in the protocol is not good for the network. So there could have been other issues that arose from that. I think that the timing just kind of happened to be, it was just the right moment, the right place at the right time for this to happen. Could it have happened later? Possibly. But I think that it would have been much more risky.
This conference today would probably be celebrating SegWit's final activation instead of Taproot discussion.
All right. One last question, just a sort of overall to sum up this sort of part of Bitcoin history. Like, Eric, I think you already touched on this. Like, what were the lessons of this episode? What are we taking with us from this period of Bitcoin history moving forward?
Well, I mean, I think that it's very important that we try to avoid politicizing this kind of stuff. And Ideally, we don't want the protocol base layer to be changing very much, because anytime that there's a change to that, it introduces an attack vector. Right away, there's, people could try to insert vulnerabilities or exploits, or possibly just try to split the community, or create, social engineering attacks or other kinds of stuff like that. So anytime that you open the door to changing the rules, you are opening yourself up to attacks. So we're kind of at a point now where it's impossible to upgrade the protocol without having some kind of process that kind of goes larger. But the more we try to scale this, the more that it tends to become political. I'm hoping that Taproot does not create the same kind of contention and that it does not become politicized. I don't think that it's a good precedent to set that these things are controversial, and that they, but at the same time, I don't want this to be a regular process. I don't want this, I don't want to make a habit out of, activating softworks all the time. But I do think that the Taproot thing is a very, very important addition to Bitcoin, and it seems to have a lot of community support. So it'd be really nice to include it now. I think that if we wait, it's actually going to get harder to activate it later. But as far as
go on.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, let me ask you a slightly different question. You mentioned that 2017 was this period of a lot of controversy, and there was the whole scaling civil war, whatever you want to call it. So was there really a problem with BIP9, or was it just a controversial time, and by now BIP9 would be fine again?
Well,
I think that you want to answer, Luke, or
whoever wants to go first.
I'll just say, I think that BIP9, the problem with BIP9 was it was very optimistic as far as like, that people would play nice and that people would cooperate. BIP9 does not work in an uncooperative scenario very well at all. And I think that, it defaults to failing. I don't know if that's something that really we want to do in the future, because if it fails, basically that means that there's still controversy. It did not get resolved. So with BIP8, it does have a flag date where it does have to activate by a certain time. So it defaults to activation, whereas BIP9 defaulted to not activating. So it removes the veto power from miners. So I think that BIP9 is very problematic. In the best of circumstances, it could possibly work, but it's just too easy to attack it.
And it creates an incentive for that attack.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what you're saying is that even in a period where there is no civil war going on or no huge controversy, using something like BIP9 would actually invite the controversy? Is that what you're concerned about?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because now the miners can hold it hostage, the soft fork that's presumably already been agreed on by the community. Because if it hasn't been agreed on by the community, we shouldn't be deploying it with any activation period.
Right.
Got it. Okay, so Luke, you've been working on BIP8, which is an alternative way to activate soft forks. Can you explain what BIP8 is?
Rather than an alternative, I look at it more of just taking BIP9 and fixing the bugs in it that we have found with the last.
Okay, so
activation.
so how is it? How are the bugs fixed? What does BIP8 do?
Well, the most obvious bug was the fact that one of the problems with BIP9 when we went to do BIP 148 was that originally it had been set for November activation, not August. And then people realized if the hash power is too low, we could force signaling starting November and it still won't activate because the time will just lapse too quickly. And this was because BIP9 used timestamps, the real world time, to determine when the BIP would expire.
Yeah, and it's a bit because blocks can be mined faster or slower, so then the real world time can get you in trouble.
Yeah, if blocks mine too slow, then the timeout would occur before the difficulty period had finished, which was one of the requirements for activation.
Yes.
And so the first thing BIP8 fixed was to get the, maybe not necessarily first, but the most obvious bug that BIP8 fixed was to use heights instead of the time. So that way, if the block slowed down, the timeout would be later as well.
Mm-hmm.
BIP 148 worked around this by moving the mandatory signaling period up to August, which was very fast. I think everyone agreed on that. It was an unfortunate necessity due to that bug. The other one is, as we were talking about, the incentive to create. It creates incentive for miners to block the soft fork. If it activates after the timeout, then that incentive is gone. there are some risks to that. If there's a bug found, then we can't back out of it once it's got the activation set. Of course, we really should be finding bugs before we set the activation anyway, so hopefully that won't matter.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, isn't it the case with BIP8 that it's configurable? You can either force signaling at the end or not.
Yeah,
how does
that was,
this work exactly?
That was a more recent change now that we got the whole activation topic back going again. It's designed so that you could deploy it with an activation that does time out and just abort, and then later on change that flag to a UASF. So if the UASF is set later, as long as it has sufficient community support to do the UASF, all the nodes that were configured without the UASF will still go along with it.
Right. Yes. And who exactly sets this flag? Is it embedded in a software release, or is it something users can manually do, or is it something you compile, or where is this? How is this?
That's kind of an implementation detail. At the end of the day, the users can modify the code, or someone can provide a release that has that modified.
Fair enough. Well, then my question is, how would you do that, or how do you see? How would you like BIP to be BIP8 to be used? How would you like to upgrade the protocol?
Because we shouldn't be deploying any activation parameters without sufficient community support, I think we should just set it up front. And honestly, I think it would be best to have another, like there was Bitcoin Core UASF with BIP148's code in it. I think it would be best to do all soft forks that way from now on and leave the vanilla Bitcoin Core releases without any soft fork activation.
Yeah, so that's an interesting perspective that you have. So would Bitcoin Core not include any BIP8 activation thing at all? It's just completely embedded in alternative clients like the BIP148 client and not in Bitcoin Core at all. So the UASF, this was the way to do it from now on.
I think that would be best. Before 2017, I would have been hesitant that the community would actually go along with it, but it worked fine with BIP148, so I don't see a reason not to continue it.
Shouldn't Bitcoin Core in that case at least include BIP8 without force signaling, so it will still enforce the soft fork and go along?
Possibly. There's also a middle ground where it can only, maybe we could have it only detect that it's been activated.
And then what?
And then
the users know they should upgrade?
Well, it can activate at that point.
No, I mean, what's the benefit of detecting that it was upgraded alone?
So that it can activate the rules and remain a full node. Because if you're not enforcing the most recent soft forks, you're no longer a full node, and that can be a security issue.
Sure. Well, that's what I meant with BIP8 without force signaling. I thought that was the same thing.
There's a pull request to BIP8, but that might make it the same thing. I'm have to look at that pull request to put that in mind. I'm not sure if it's identical quite yet. Right.
Eric, what do you think of this idea of activating soft forks through alternative clients like BIP148 did?
I think that's probably a good idea. I think that it's best for Bitcoin Core to remain out of the whole process as far as like, you know, the less political that Bitcoin Core is, the better. And the people that have worked on these BIPs actually don't want, for the most part, don't really want to get too involved in this kind of you know, public stuff, and I think it's for the best. I think it would set really horrible precedent for Bitcoin Core to be deploying protocol changes in itself. I think that it's very important that the community support be there and be demonstrated outside of the Bitcoin Core project, and that it be decisive, and that it doesn't become politicized once it's deployed. So I think that it's important that that there's enough support for it prior to deployment, and that it's pretty sure that it's going to happen. And then at that point, there's no more decisions to make or anything like that, because any other decision that's added to the process just adds more potential points where people could try to add controversy.
So why is the problem if Bitcoin Core activates soft forks, or soft forks are implemented in the Bitcoin Core client, or however you want to put it? Why is that a problem?
It sets a really bad precedent because you know, Bitcoin Core has become the reference implementation. It's the most widely used you know, node software, and It's very dangerous. It's kind of like a separation of powers kind of thing. It'd be really dangerous for Bitcoin Core to have the ability to implement these kinds of things and deploy them, especially under the radar. I think it'd be really, really dangerous. It's very important that this stuff be reviewed and that everyone get a chance to look at it. And I think that right now the people that are working on Bitcoin Core might be good, reliable, honest people, but eventually they're it could get infiltrated by people, or other people could get in that might not have the best of intentions, and so it could become dangerous at some point if it becomes a habit to do it that way. Because it might not get reviewed.
Or Bitcoin Core developers could be coerced or get phone calls from
especially
three-letter agencies. Luke,
especially if there's a precedent or even an appearance of this supposed power,
right.
It's going to cause people who are malicious to think they can pressure developers and attempt to do that, even if it doesn't work out.
Yeah. Well, the obvious downside, though, is that if not enough people upgrade to this alternative client in this case, then it could partition the network, right? It could split the network. It could cause the chaos we discussed before with chain reorgs. Is this not a risk you're concerned about then, or how do you see this?
If it doesn't have enough support prior, then probably it shouldn't be done at all. So I think that there should be the support should be there, and it should be very clear that there is almost unanimous agreement, or a very huge amount of the community wants this before any actual code is deployed. And at the point that the code is deployed, I think that at that point it'd be pretty reasonable to expect that people would want to run it. Otherwise, I think it shouldn't be done at all.
Right. So, but it does sort of put a deadline for people to upgrade their software. People can't be too lazy. People need to actually do something, otherwise risks will emerge.
Sure.
Well, that's true no matter what release it's in.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say I want to put a hypothetical in front of you then. Let's say this solution is chosen. There's this alternative client that includes the soft fork with forced activation in some way or another. It doesn't actually get the support you guys are predicting it will get or hoping it will get, and it does cause a chain split. Which version is Bitcoin then in that case? Like how, Luke, which
the
version?
community would have to just decide on that. It's not something that any one person can rule on or predict.
Okay. Eric?
Either rest of the community will upgrade, or the people who did upgrade will have no choice but to revert.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really, at that point, we're kind of in uncharted territory in a lot of ways. And I think that it's just, we have to see if the incentives align for enough people to really want to get behind one particular version of Bitcoin or not. And if there's a significant risk that it could split the network permanently in a way that does not lead to a decisive outcome, then I would not support it. I think that it's important that there at least be a theoretically high probability that the network will tend to converge. At least the strong economic nodes will tend to converge on one particular blockchain.
Also keep in mind that it's not enough to simply not upgrade with something like this. They would have to explicitly lock in a block that rejects Taproot. Otherwise, there would be a risk of the Taproot chain overtaking their chain and replacing it.
Yeah. So what kind of timeline would you think in this regard? Luke, I think I've seen you mention a year, maybe. Is that right? Or?
Well, it's important that the full nodes upgrade, not just the miners. So from the date that the first release is made, I think there needs to be at least 3 months before signaling can even begin. And then once it begins, I think maybe a year would be a good, not too long, not too short,
I think a year.
I'm thinking that a year might actually be a little bit long. I think that there's a trade-off here. Obviously, the shorter the time frame, then the more risk that there won't be enough time for people to upgrade. But at the same time, the longer that this goes on, the more uncertainty there is, and that also causes problems. So I think it's it's good to find the right balance. I think that a year might be a little bit too long. I don't think it's going to take that long. I would prefer this to happen more quickly. I would actually like this to happen the quickest possible that doesn't cause a chain split or that reduces the risk of a chain split. That would be my preference.
Well, don't forget miners can signal still and activate it sooner than the 1 year.
Sure. Sure. I mean, I guess, but then there's also the veto thing, and people possibly just using the uncertainty to, mess with the markets or other kind of stuff like that. So
I don't know if there's an incentive to try to veto when it's just going to delay it a year.
yeah, I mean, yeah.
Well, so I guess sort of the other perspective in this debate would be more in line of, for example, I think Matt Corallo called this, or at least he used that name in his email header, which was modern soft fork activation. I assume you are aware with that, but I'll explain this real quick myself. So modern soft fork activation, the idea is that basically use sort of the old-fashioned BIP 9 upgrades process for a year. So let miners activate it for a year. If it doesn't work, then developers will reconsider for 6 months, see if there was a problem with Taproot in this case. After all, something they missed, some concern miners had with it. Review it for 6 months. If after the 6 months it's found there was no actual problem and miners were just delaying for whatever reason, then activation is redeployed with a hard deadline activation at 2 years. What do you think of this? I hope I explained this right.
If there's possibly a problem, we shouldn't even get to that first step.
Exactly. I'm not a big fan of this because I think that if there's too many questions raised and it doesn't feel like there's decisive, that there's a decision that's been made, then people are just going to kind of be totally confused. It's going to cause a lot of uncertainty. I think that this is something where we need to either be very aggressive about it and get everyone on board and be decisive and say, yes, this is going to happen, or it's not worth doing at all. I don't like this idea of, seeing what happens in 6 months or whatever. Right? That just doesn't, we either decide right away that yes, we're going to do it or no.
It kind of invites controversy.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
The idea though is by laying the plan out like this, then there is still the guarantee that it will ultimately activate. Like it might take a little longer than a year, but in the end of the road, it will activate.
You could do that with BIP 8 with just not locking in on the timeout and then setting the timeout later if you decide to do that.
Yeah, the more variables.
Sure, that's a variation. Sure, there's sort of different ways of thinking about this, but I get the real question I want to get is what's the rush? Like, aren't we in it for the long run? Aren't we here planning to, build something that will be here for 200 years? Like, what does an extra year or two matter?
Well, I mean, I think that for the testing and review of the actual Taproot proposal, for sure, it should have enough time. We should not rush that. I think that we should not try to deploy anything until the developers that are working on it and that are reviewing and testing it are confident that it is at a level where it is safe to deploy. And that's independent of all the activation stuff. I think that the activation, though, should be quick. I don't think it will take that long to bring people on board. I mean, we're talking probably like a few months at most to get everyone on board if it is going to happen. If it's taking longer than that, then chances are it doesn't have enough support. And so we probably shouldn't be doing it in the first place. And if it takes, if people can't do it that quickly, then I think that the whole process is, questionable. And the more variables that we add to the process later, the more it invites controversy, and the more that people might just get more confused and think that it's more uncertain. And with this kind of stuff, I think that people are looking for decisiveness and are looking for resolution. And keeping this kind of uncertain and on hold for a very long period of time is not healthy for the network. So the activation part, I think, should be quick. The deployment should take as long as it's necessary to make sure that the code actually is good. We should not be deploying code that has not been fully tested and reviewed. But once we decide that, yes, this is what should be done, then I think that at that point it should be quick, or otherwise we shouldn't do it at all.
Luke,
the decision, of course, being made by the community. Mm-hmm. No, I agree with Eric.
Okay, well, so I think one argument, another argument in favor of Matt's perspective here is that, so the code should be good before you deploy it, but maybe in reality, in the real world, a lot of people will only really start looking at the code, will only really start looking at the upgrade once it's actually out there, once there's a software release that includes it. So in that case, this, by not immediately forcing the activation, this allows, realistically seen, more time for review. What do you think, Luke?
I think if people have something to review, they should review it before it gets to that point, before there's any activation set. Ideally before it gets merged.
Yeah.
Eric, do you see any merit in this argument?
Well, I mean, for sure, the more eyes that look at it, and you know, I think that it's better. But I think that nothing would presumably get merged and deployed or released until at least enough eyeballs that are competent in this are able to do it. And right now, I think the people that are most motivated are the people that are actually working on it directly. There might be more eyeballs that look at it later. Yeah, for sure. Once it's actually out there and once the activation has been set and everything, then it'll get more attention. But I don't think that that's really the time that people should start reviewing. I think that the review should really be taking place before that.
If at that point, if there was an issue found, there's going to be a question of, is it worth redoing all this just to fix that issue, or should we just go ahead anyway? And if the issue is bad enough, miners could activate it simply because of the issue, because they want to take advantage of it. That's, we really need to not, we don't want it to activate if there's a big issue. We need that to be, we need to be completely sure there's no issues before we even get to the activation stage.
So let me throw out another sort of idea that's been circulating. What if we do a sort of BIP8 with force signaling towards the end, but give it a long time, and then after a while you can always sort of speed it up with a new client that you know that includes something forcing miners to signal sooner, something like this.
With the current BIP8, you can't do that, but Anthony Towns has a pull request that will hopefully fix that.
So do you see merit in this?
I don't really think that it's a good idea to be, I mean, the more we can reduce variables once it's been deployed, the better. I think that we should really be looking at getting all this stuff ironed out before. If it's not been done before, then someone hasn't done their job right. That's my way of looking at it. And I think that, you know, if things are done right, then by the time that it's actually out for activation, then there should be no more controversy. It should just be, okay, let's just get this thing out there and get it done.
But that might be a reason to start with a 1-year timeout. Then we can move it to 6 months if that turns out to be too long.
But then we're inviting more controversy potentially, and like last time it was kind of a mess with having to deploy BIP 148 and BIP 91, and then like all this other stuff to kind of patch it. You know, the less patchwork necessary there, the better. I think that it sets a bad precedent if it's not decisive and if it's not done. I think that if the community has not decided to do this, it should not be done at all. If it has decided to do it, then it should be decisive and quick. And I think that that's the best precedent we can set, because the more that we delay stuff and the more that there's controversy and the more it just invites a lot more potential for things to happen in the future that I think could be problematic.
Right. Yeah. Well, so I could throw another idea out there, but I suspect your answer will be the same. I'll throw it out there anyway. So right now I propose this idea where you have a long BIP8 period with force signaling towards the end, and then you can speed it up later if you decide to. The opposite of that would be to have a long BIP8 signaling period without force signaling towards the end, and then at some point decide, okay, we're going to do force signaling anyways. But I guess your answer would be the same. You don't like solutions that need to be patched along the way.
Right. Yeah.
Luke, do you want to respond to that idea, or?
No, he's got a point.
Okay. Last question, I think. A lot of people out there actually like protocol ossification. They like it if Bitcoin, at least at some point in the future, proves unable to upgrade.
I would like that.
Okay, so why would you like that?
Well, because that removes the politics out of the protocol. As long as you can change stuff, it opens the door to politics. Just, you know, people being able to change stuff. And I mean, all constitutional forms of government, all, you know, even like a lot of like the Abrahamic religions, you know, kind of are based on this idea that you have this thing that's a protocol that doesn't change. And then whenever there's a change, basically like there's some kind of schism or some kind of, you know, break in the system. And I think that when it comes to something, when really like the network effect is such a huge component of this whole thing, and really splits can really be problematic in terms of people just not being able to trade between themselves. I think it's something where the less politics that are involved, the better, and people are going to become political about it. And the higher the stakes, the more that people are going to want to attack it. And the less vectors of attack there are, the safer. It would be nice if we could just get it so that there's no more changes to the protocol at the base layer, but there's always going to be improvements that could be proposed, because we always learn from hindsight, and we could always say, well, we can, make this better or do this other thing better. The question is, where do we draw the line? Where do we say, okay, it's good enough and no more changes from now on? And can that really be done? Is it possible for people to really decide that this is what the protocol is going to be? And then there's also another issue, which is, what if later on some issue is discovered that requires some protocol change to fix some kind of catastrophic bug or some vulnerability or something, and at that point, well, there could be some kind of emergency measure to do it, which might not set precedent for this kind of thing to become a regular thing. But anytime that you invoke any kind of emergency measures, it opens the door for attacks. Yeah, I don't know where that line is. And I think that that's a really difficult question.
Yeah, I think Nick Szabo has described it as social scalability, right? I think that's what you're referring to. You think ossification would benefit social scalability.
Maybe. I think.
Do you agree with this?
No
more upgrades, ossification?
Nah. I think maybe in the far future, maybe it can be considered, but in Bitcoin's current stage, where it is today, if Bitcoin stops improving, that opens the door for altcoins to replace it, and Bitcoin eventually just becoming irrelevant.
So when you say maybe at some point in the future, like
far
when
future.
would this? Do you have any sort of
it's too
idea
early to say
when it's done?
I think anyone who is sure of anything like that is pretty much full of shit. I don't think anyone really understands this problem well enough yet.
There's too much we don't understand about how Bitcoin should work. There's too many improvements that should and can be made. At this point, it really seems like it should be out of the question at this point.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So why would it be a problem if Bitcoin turns out, like, let's say this fails for some reason, this soft fork fails, it doesn't activate. What we're all going to learn in the next 2 years is that Bitcoin can't actually upgrade anymore, and this is it. This is what we're going to live with. Why is this a problem, or is this a problem?
Well, I mean, there are certain issues that exist with the protocol right now. For instance, privacy is a huge one. And there could be some other potential improvements to the crypto that allow for much more sophisticated either compression or more privacy or other kinds of stuff that would be significantly beneficial. And if some other coin is able to launch that has these features, it does have the issue of not having the same kind of founding story as Bitcoin, and that kind of myth that kind of, I think is necessary to kind of create a movement like this. And it creates incentives for the, early players to kind of, like what's happened with the altcoins and all these, ICOs and stuff like that, where the founders basically, end up having too much control over the protocol. And so that's an issue where I think Bitcoin really maintains its network effect just because of that. But there could be some technical improvement at some point that is so significant that really Bitcoin would be at a serious disadvantage if it did not incorporate something like that.
At this point, I think it's a given that there will be.
Yeah.
You started out by mentioning, for example, privacy. Don't you think, you probably mentioned, well, anyways, let's stick with privacy. Isn't this something you think could ultimately be solved good enough on second layers right now, as the protocols right now?
Possibly. I mean, yeah. I'm not sure. I don't think anyone has a complete answer to this, unfortunately.
Good enough. The definition of good enough may change as privacy invading technology improves. If the governments get so much better at, or not even governments, but just anyone gets better at, invading everyone's privacy, what we need to protect against that could very well raise the bar.
All right, I think we got about 5 minutes left. I'm sort of out of questions, but we can discuss Taproot itself a little bit. Is that a good idea? Luke, what's great about Taproot? Why do you support it, if you support it?
It significantly simplifies what has to happen on chain. Right now, we've got all the smart contract capabilities. I mean, we have since 2009, but in most cases, you don't need to have the smart contract. If both parties see, okay, it's going to end up a certain way, they can just both sign a single transaction, and then all the smart contract stuff can be bypassed.
Right.
And that's pretty much the main benefit of Taproot. You can bypass all the smart contracts in most cases. And then,
Yeah, right.
Then all the full nodes, they'd have a cheap verification, very little overhead.
And all the transactions would look the same basically. So nobody would really be able to see what the contracts are. All the contracts would actually run off chain, which would be significant improvement for scalability and for privacy. So I think it's a win all around.
Yeah, I mean, basically, instead of everybody running the smart contract, it's just the participants.
Right, which is the way it should have been in the beginning, but I think that it took a while, until people realized that that's really what the script should be doing. Initially, it was thought, well, we could have these scripts that run on chain, and this is kind of like the way that was just done, because I don't think that Satoshi really thought this completely through. That we just wanted to launch something, and I think that we have a lot of hindsight now that we didn't have back then, but now it's obvious that really, the blockchain is really about authorizing transactions. It's not actually about processing the conditions of contracts themselves. That can all be done off chain, and that can be done very well off chain. In the end, the only thing is that the participants need to sign off that it did happen, and that's it. And that's all that everyone really cares about, is that everyone agreed. So what's the big deal? If everyone agrees, then there's no issue.
Yeah, there doesn't appear to be any downside to Taproot, I think, right? Or Luke, is there any downside to it? Have you heard of any concern? I think there was an email on the mailing list a while ago, right? With some.
I mean, you can always use non-Taproot stuff with Taproot, but no, I can't think there's any. There's no reason not to deploy it. At least I can't think of any reason not to use it either.
Yeah.
I mean, it does carry over the bias that SegWit has toward bigger blocks, but that's something that has to be considered independently.
Yeah, I'm assuming.
There's no reason to tie the features to the block size.
Blocks should still be smaller, Luke. Is that still your position?
Yeah, but that's independent of Taproot.
Sure. Are there any other soft forks you guys are excited about, or that you could see be deployed on Bitcoin in the next couple of years? Upcoming.
Well, there's the any prevout, which was formerly called no input. I think that's making good progress. There's the check template verify, which I still haven't looked too much into, but it seems like it's got significant community support building up at least. And then once Taproot's deployed, there'll probably be a bunch of other improvements on top of that.
Yeah, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, after the last software after SegWit activated, I was really kind of like just so burned out by the whole process, because this thing was really a more than 2-year process. If we think about 2015 was really when this whole thing kind of started, and it didn't activate until August 1st of 2017, right? So that's more than 2 years of this kind of stuff going on. I don't know if I have an appetite for a very protracted battle with this at all. I kind of want to see what happens with Taproot first before kind of weighing in on other soft forks, because that one's, Taproot's the one that seems to have the most support right now as far as like something that's kind of like a no-brainer. Yes, this would be good to have. I would like to see that first. And once that activates, then I'll maybe have other ideas of what to do next. But right now I don't know. It's too early.
All right. I think we have about 1 more minute left, 2 maybe. What are your final thoughts? Final thoughts of soft fork activation. What do you want to tell our viewers, Eric?
Well, I think it's really important that we set a good precedent here. I had kind of talked about 3 different categories of risks, right? The first risk category is just the technical stuff, making sure that the code doesn't have any bugs and stuff like that. The second one was with the activation methodology and making sure that the network doesn't split. And the third one is with precedent. Inviting potential attacks in the future by people exploiting the process itself. And the third part is the one that I think is the least well understood. I think that the first part is the part that was most understood even back in 2015. The second category was the one that the whole SegWit activation kind of, showed us a lot of things about, and although we were discussing about with BIP8 and BIP9 is with that kind of stuff. The category 3 risks right now, I think, are very unknown. And that's my biggest concern. So I would like to see that there isn't any kind of precedent established where you know, this kind of stuff could be exploited in the future, and it's a really tough line to draw exactly how, you know, how aggressive we should be with this, and whether that sets, you know, something up for someone else in the future to do something bad. But yeah, I think that we can only learn by doing it, and we have to take risks. We're already in uncharted territories with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is already a risky proposition to begin with. So, you know, we have to take some risks. They should be calculated risks, and we should learn as we go along and correct ourselves as quickly as possible. Other than that, I don't really know exactly what the process will end up looking like. But yeah, I think that we're learning a lot, and I think that right now the category 3 stuff, I think, is the key stuff that we're going to see in this. If this thing actually happens, I think that's really important to consider.
Luke, any final thoughts?
Not really.
All right, I think that's it then. Thanks, guys. I'm not sure if I'm not getting a signal from CK on whether or not we're still live. So I don't have any questions, but Eric, are these your